This is the sociology of technology that we need to get used to.
Yeah. Okay, everyone needs to go silent now. There are 20 people waiting. Good afternoon and welcome to the Fabian Dialogues in the summer term at the LSE South Asia Centre. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm Deputy Director of the Centre here at the LSE. Welcome everyone, and a very quick apology before I begin to those who have been waiting. I could see that there were quite a few people waiting on the YouTube website, but here we are. I'm delighted to host this event this afternoon, which is in collaboration with the Fabian Society, and the Secretary of the Fabian Society, Andrew Harrop, is here as well, and I'm going to introduce him just now. But before that, I thought I'd just say a few words about how this series of events came about, and what were the concerns that brought them together, and what we think we've been able to achieve in the series of events. We had an event in November, the first dialogue, which was on Sydney and Beatrice Webb, who are two of the founders of LSE and also members of the Fabian Society. In March this year, in Lent term, we had an event on Harold Lasky and his role and his influence on students from India and in the Indian national movement, the freedom struggle rather, as it was becoming more active over here in the United Kingdom. Now, sometime last summer, when I first thought of this idea of having Fabian Dialogues, and I reached out to Andrew in the Fabian Society, and I'm delighted to say that Andrew responded very quickly and very positively to it. There were several reasons why I had thought of doing this series. One of them was to actually explore the relationship between members of the Fabian Society who were also members of LSE and who had an engagement with South Asia as a region, any country in South Asia, or even generally with the region. So that was one important reason why I wanted to explore this. The other was that I'm sure several of you will recall that last summer was one of the several points at which suddenly there seemed to erupt a fair amount of discussion over questions of decolonization and related issues, decolonization of knowledge especially. And in fact, the Center also did a separate series called Decolonizing Law, which was looking at the entire corpus of law in South Asia and how it is still very closely tied to colonial law. So decolonization was a very important concern. But what I discovered while looking up the Fabians and the wider issues concerning them, especially and the kinds of conversations that were happening at LSE, was that there are several issues where the discussion does not happen very in enough detail for us to be able to have a proper understanding of the contexts in which several trends and thoughts and activities were happening, and some of them rightly grate against our good senses today. One of them, for instance, was the support to eugenics that a lot of Fabians had, and this has come up for a lot of discussion at LSE amongst faculty members, amongst students, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, there were also, for instance, Labour Party's articulation of decolonization as in the support for freedom movements after the Second World War. And these questions are very complicated. They need to be talked about, and we need to talk about the positives, the negatives, and how these are entangled and can be separated and cannot be separated. And the same person or the same set of actors could be seen to be doing several kinds of things. So when I wrote to Andrew, I spoke of this tension in the context, and the context from which LSE itself as an institution has sprung. And this complicated engagement is couched in, obviously, because of its times, in wider contexts that are today important questions for us, contexts of race, of class, of empire, of imperialism, and so on and so forth. And we have not shied away in our discussions about the webs or in our discussion about Lasky with these kinds of questions. One of these questions was also about voice and who speaks for whom, and the appropriation of voice or the absorption of voice. And it was for this reason that we also agreed that in our dialogues, we will include Fabians who may not have been directly connected with LSE. And Leonard Woolf, whom we will discuss today, is in fact not formally otherwise connected with LSE. Now, why are these questions important? What is the point about having these discussions beyond what is already known? The context is, and we will continue next year with several such conversations, the context is that we need to talk about these issues openly and easily because just to give one example, if it is true, since I mentioned eugenics, and the question of eugenics at LSE has come up, and certain actions have been taken. For instance, a particular departmental library has been renamed. It is equally true to highlight that several members of the Fabian Society, like the Webs, also greatly supported universal education, making education available. The Webs in particular traveled around the world, including in South Asia, to raise funds for the establishment of the LSE. LSE's, of course, former director, Henry Beveridge, is the author of the modern welfare state in Britain following the Second World War. There was Richard Titmuss, who must get credit for making the study of social administration a discipline at LSE, and so on and so forth. For all these reasons, and for much more than what I have said in a potted summary over here, the history of LSE, the developments and the evolution of LSE, and the history of members of the Fabian Society are very closely interlinked. And for that reason, I'm also very happy to say that the Fabian Dialogues are the only series of events we do at the center that are also part of the anniversary celebrations, the 125th anniversary celebrations of the LSE that are being celebrated last year and this year. Now, before I introduce the panelists, a few pieces of information for those who are watching us on YouTube, our audience. Thank you very much for joining us. This is, as you know, being live streamed on YouTube, and a recording of this will be made available from tomorrow in our events archive section for those who may not be able to watch it today and may want to revisit it later. The chat function on YouTube has been enabled, so please feel free to ask questions via the chat function. You can pose a question to a particular speaker, in which case please mention the name of the speaker. You're also welcome to pose a question to the entire panel, and I will pose it to them. When I pose the question, I will not take your name. I will simply read out the question because had this been an on-site event, as it would normally have been, members of audience at LSE events have the freedom to not reveal their names or their identity while asking a question. In this instance, of course, because it's on YouTube and your names are visible to everyone else, the best I can do is to not announce your name, so it will at least not be in the recording. If you would like to tweet, then please do tag us at SAsiaLSC. And we are going to, I'm just going to explain how we're going to do the event, but you're free to type in your questions at any time, or you can wait till you've heard all the speakers and then begin to type in your questions, and I will remind you about the questions at that point. It is now my very pleasant task to introduce our speakers, to each of whom I'm very grateful for having agreed to participate in this discussion today. May I begin with introducing Dr. Alexander Bubb, who is Senior Lecturer in English at Roehampton University, and his expertise is in 19th and 20th century British literature and its engagement with South Asia. Minoli Salgado is Professor of International Writing at Manchester Metropolitan University and is the author of Writing Sri Lanka, Literature, Resistance and the Politics of Place, which was published in 2012. I do not normally mention the name of publishers, but in this instance, I'm going to say that it was published by Routledge because earlier in my life, I used to work at Routledge. Minoli has also published 2 works of fiction that are set in Sri Lanka. I have also requested Minoli at some point to tell us a bit more about her family history, which is both interesting and relevant to our discussion today. Dr. Peter Wilson is Associate Professor of International Relations at LSE and is the author of The International Theory of Leonard Woolf, a study in 20th-century idealism, which was published in 2003. Andrew Harrop is an LSE alumnus and is Secretary of the Fabian Society. I am going to hand over to Andrew now, but before that, I just want to announce that prior to this event, this is for the benefit of the audience, we have decided on the order of the speakers. So once Andrew has spoken, Minoli will speak first, then Alexander, then Peter, and then we'll start the discussion. Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, Nilanjan. And let me just repeat this sort of welcome from the Fabian Society's perspective, and also our pleasure in doing this collaboration with the LSE. The purpose of this series of events is to explore the intertwined history of the Fabian Society and the LSE and our shared engagement with questions of race, empire, as Nilanjan has said, eugenics, and colonialism and decolonialization. The theme of today's session is, of course, to look at the thinking and writing of Leonard Woolf, who is not always known, was a very prominent member of the Fabian Society, as well as sort of a backroom advisor to the Labour Party, really throughout his working life. So he was initially sort of brought into the Fabian fold, very much a sort of, if you sort of read about it, it sort of feels like he was a, you know, sort of a mentee of Sidney Webb, you know, sort of when he, shortly after he came back from Sri Lanka as a former colonial administrator. And he was sort of brought into the Fabian fold and then remained very involved in the Fabian Society right through from the sort of pre-First World War period through to the late 1940s, was serving on various committees of the Fabian Society, but also writing a great deal. And his, you know, some of his important early thinking, particularly the work he did on international relations in the time of the First World War, really spun out of work he'd been asked to do by the Fabian Society. He was also a leading contributor to the New Statesman magazine, which was itself an offshoot of the Fabian Society, was founded just before the First World War by the Webbs. And in those early days, there was sort of a real, you know, sort of interplay between the work of Fabians like Woolf and the New Statesman. So, and often we think of the New Statesman and the LSE as sort of two sort of products of early Fabian Society thinking that sort of grew, you know, sort of out of and bigger than the Fabian Society. So we're going to obviously today be thinking about the career of Leonard Woolf, but thinking about that in the context, I think, of broader engagement between the British left and questions of race and empire, and particularly South Asia. And today the focus will be on Ceylon or Sri Lanka, in particular, where he worked. Very interesting to see that, you know, so very shortly after he returned, that he, you know, became a real advocate for self-determination and self-government in South Asia, and advised the Labour Party and through his Fabian Society links on those issues during the First World War and in the years very shortly after the First World War, when there were others on the left who were much more cautious about the approach taken. And I think we've discussed in previous sessions that the Fabian Society's leading members reflected the range of views and sometimes ambivalence about independence movements and about self-determination. So Woolf was sort of one example of that, but it by no means representative of all thinking within the Fabian Society. I think that's everything I want to say, because we really want to sort of hand over to the experts. But I just wanted to say one anecdote that came out from preparing for this event was a story from the first time that Leonard Woolf attended a Fabian summer school. And these days we'd say he was called out. George Bernard Shaw ticked him off for using the term native, which of course he would have used as a colonial administrator a few years before. But in the circles that he was moving in as he joined the sort of the Labour Party and the Fabian Society, at least some people were calling out use of language. I suspect others were not. So with that thought, let me turn first of all to Minoli.
Hello. Hello, thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Nilanjan. I might come back to those personal links later, but for now I want to focus on Woolf and his work. So as you mentioned, I work broadly on post-independence Sri Lankan literature, which is of course a later period than the world that Woolf's fiction takes us into. And I'm really happy about the great caution with which you've addressed the framing of Woolf's work, which is evident in the use of quotation marks around Ceylon and the question mark that follows, which indicates a high degree of uncertainty, not only about Woolf's positioning, but about how we might represent the country itself. It marks Ceylon out as both a product and a construct of the British Empire. This uncertainty about framing has been played out in the very different responses to Woolf's work, which, as Ruvani Rana Singh has pointed out, registers a spectrum of responses in Sri Lanka, with early responses claiming that Woolf was an anti-imperialist and later responses claiming that he was an imperialist. Interestingly, in the West, he gets positioned as an anti-imperialist, largely in the light of his political writing and calls for internationalism. And there's a whole area of debate there about responses to Woolf, which I think are interesting to explore further. But I'd like really to focus on the other part of your title, on voice, which, as you rightly mentioned, is a really highly contentious area today, about who speaks for whom, the ethics, aesthetics and politics of speaking for another. The greatest praise for Woolf so far seems to come from those who claim his book has a victim-orientated perspective, and the fact that the book focalizes events through the experience of Silindu, a villager who is also an outsider, a hunter, called a Vadda in the text. Now, the Vaddas are the originary peoples of the island who are hunter-gatherers. Nihal Fernando has even said that the book evinces even more empathy than local Ceylonese writers writing at the time. And interestingly, Woolf himself claimed in his diary that he tried to vicariously live the villagers' lives. Now, I find the term vicariously really interesting because it shows a real consciousness of his own self-indulgence. An element of self-criticism has really come in there. And he's also described himself as an anti-imperialist who enjoyed the flesh pots of imperialism, which I think is a really agonized way of expressing his position in relation to the country. So to return to this issue of the aesthetics, ethics, and politics of speaking for another in the text and his short stories, I would like to emphasize that Woolf really was conscious of these issues, particularly on the ethics and politics of speaking for another. What really struck me on reading Woolf's fiction is how his voicing and representation of the other is weighted with a sense of responsibility for the other. While his representations are underpinned by many invocations of the brute animality of the natives, there is an appeal towards establishing not only a human connection with the other, but a taking responsibility for the other, which is in alignment with Levinas's claim that we are not only constituted as subjects in our encounter with the other, but called into responsibility. Now, if you put that within the colonial context, this responsibility becomes refracted into a kind of paternalism, which places Woolf's fiction as a mark of a kind of benevolent, paternalistic imperialism. Now, to consider voice again more closely and to look at language and literacy, Elika Burma has claimed The Village in the Jungle is a double-voiced or multi-voiced text. Others have pointed out that it is generically mixed, a hybrid form, borrowing heavily from diaries and which contains merry paratexts and glosses. Someone has reflected on it as an ethnographic study in narrative form. All these reflections point to the fact that this novel is based upon realities experienced on the ground by Woolf in Ceylon. And I believe this takes us back, these elements takes us back to the tussle with voice and representation, and supports Victoria and Glendenning's point that Woolf was in a state of multiple conflict at the time of writing Village in the Jungle. This tussle is marked through both a celebratory excess of linguistic registers and through a closure of language and discourse. The former is found in many different ways. In the many different ways Woolf articulates voice and the challenges of mediating it. His embedded use of Sinhala throughout, Sinhala words are there in almost every sentence, reveal a desire to represent Ceylon with a fine grain, to touch the country through its language. This idea really has contemporary relevance in the context of linguistic nationalism, because identity today is largely linked to language proficiency. Woolf, of course, learned Sinhala and Tamil, going well beyond the call of duty during his time in the country. Anyway, all these elements result in a kind of polyphonic text that works to present a pluralistic Ceylon, one made up of a rich diversity of peoples. And this, I believe, is strikingly present in that extended scene of what he calls the Perahara, but which might be more accurately called a pilgrimage to what is likely Kathurgama. Woolf also had a knowledge of the whole country as he worked in Kandy, Hambantota and Jaffna. Woolf draws on a rich tradition of oral storytelling and cites a Jataka tale. A Jataka tale is a story of a Buddha's former life, which is a narrative staple in the country. This multi-voicedness is framed differently in his framed tales, such as Tale Told by Moonlight, which is closer to Conrad's framing in Heart of Darkness. But so the novel's polyphony, which is a central symptom of the novel, is that it has a multi-voicedness built into it. This novel's polyphony is a nation-framing act of representation before the nation of Sri Lanka, as it was to become later, existed, of course. Now, you could counterpoint this free-flowing discourse and pluralism against Woolf's drawing attention to the barriers of communication marked by the imposition of the alien tongue and colonial bureaucracy, the famous misunderstandings in the court scene, and the fact that Babahami, the village headman, only has his position as he's the one person in the village who can write his name, testifies to the role literacy plays in empowerment. Yet, as Woolf shows, language under the colonial system does not bridge difference, but reinforces it, and colonized and colonized are both estranged by the system they work in. And I believe that court scene is absolutely crucial in our engagement with that aspect of his work. So it is not voice that commands power, but the ability to be heard and understood. And in this novel, Woolf repeats Forster's call to only connect, but offers no semblance or possibility of a cultural translator within the text, no mimic man who might menace colonial power. Rather, this novel shows us how the system is exploited by headmen, tradesmen, debt collectors for their own ends, peoples whose rapaciousness matches the rapaciousness of the jungle. In Village in the Jungle, Woolf is not only attempting to mark out a narrative space for voicing the other, but a place from which the outsider might speak. The outsider, who in the case of Cylinder is also the scapegoat, whose precarious life throws into relief the machinations of sovereign power. Ultimately, as the beginning and the ending of the novel shows, and both the beginning and ending, of course, are framed by the jungle, the novel resists colonial framing and works to assert the existence of a cosmological order, which is best served not by economic considerations, I believe, but by a form of magical thinking, a form of thinking which anticipates the mythopoeic in modernism. As one of his characters in Pearls and Swine says, What I want is to give you the feeling of facts out there, the different reality in the East. You feel small, not very powerful. Facts for Woolf can only be understood through empathy, affect, circuits of feeling. Woolf may well be a patrician imperialist, and I, for one, believe, he is. But in his aesthetic allegiances, he uses ethnographic registers to resist the colonial project of ethnography, asserting that facts need to be felt if they are to matter at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minoli. That was very, very interesting and absolutely to the point. And I can tell you, I already have some questions, but I'm sure others will be as well. But you've provided us not only a very interesting set of ideas, but also a very interesting framing of it. I did want to, the reason I came in just now to speak is I did want to say to you that, we did give a lot of thought to how we could communicate the complexity of what we were trying to discuss through the title. And as you would understand, and all of us work in higher education institutions, is that, putting things within quotes followed by a question mark in the title, everything just complicates and gets everyone's backs up. So one had to, and at the same time, I wanted to be absolutely clear that there were two or three things. One is I wanted to be very clear in making the link between Woolf and the word Ceylon. I wanted to be, so I was absolutely determined to use both those words. But I had to convey to those who would be signing up that the use of the word Ceylon without quote marks is problematic for a variety of reasons, just as because of its time period, it is justifiable in many ways as well. But for us now, in retrospect, it is problematic. The question mark was, as you have very eloquently elaborated, was more about the question of voice. The question mark is actually not associated to Ceylon. That was taken care of in the quote marks. The question mark was about, can people speak? This ventriloquism that is inherent in this kind of thing. But thank you very much. We're going to come back to all of this. May I just very quickly introduce once again our next speaker, because there are several people I notice on YouTube who have joined since Minoli started to speak. So for the benefit of those who have joined just now, our next speaker is Dr. Alexander Bubb, who is Senior Lecturer in English at Roehampton University. And Alex's expertise is in 19th and 20th century British literature and its engagement with South Asia. Alex, please speak now.
Thank you, Nilanjan. And hello, everyone. I'm sure you realize this is not really my bookline study. I've posed myself in front of a photo of the complete works of Voltaire as a joking tribute to Leonard Woolf's luggage, because as he relates in Growing, his autobiography from his years in Sri Lanka, when he arrived in Jaffna in 1904, he was carrying with him 90 volumes of the complete works of Voltaire, which he then had carted and railroaded across the country for his subsequent postings throughout the island. But I'm going to just use my time now to set Leonard Woolf in the wider context of imperialism and globalization in the first decades of the 20th century, and to consider what kind of a contribution he thought he might be able to make to the literary portrayal of these phenomena upon his decision to quit the civil service in 1912 and become a writer. And like Minoli, I'd like to do this by focusing on voice and voicing. So there's a passage in Woolf's short story Pearls and Swine where he achieves a startling and comic effect. The story opens in a Torquay hotel where two armchair imperialists are debating British rule in Asia. One of them is a soi-disant liberal with constitutionalist sympathies and some pleasant notions about the good work being done by certain doctors and missionaries. The other is a racist and cynical advocate of a kind of strong-armed paternalism. At any rate, neither man has any first-hand knowledge of what he is talking about, and they merely represent different varieties of ignorance. But as their debate drags on, another man sitting nearby begins to fidget restlessly before at last giving a loud and indignant groan and suddenly interrupting their conversation with a sharp burst of tumult. The speaker turns out to be a retired district officer from India, and the words are a sarcastic adage about people who try to control what they don't understand. Or to give the remarks literal meaning, I won't venture to pronounce the words, but any Tamil speakers who are participating in the event today, I would welcome them to give us their authentic pronunciation of the adage. But the literal meaning is that, oh, he knows everything from Benares to Rameshwaram. Otherwise, he imagines that he knows everything across the length and breadth of the subcontinent. At any rate, the eruption of these words of protest into a cozy enclave of male British privilege effectively raises the question, who has the right to speak for colonial Ceylon and its people? The answer that Pearls and Swine offers is ultimately a rather conventional one. Authority resides in the voice of the experienced white administrator, who, once he has seized his company's attention, delivers in a dry and jaded tone a very nasty anecdote about the true realities of colonial rule. I say conventional because much the same happens in various stories by Conrad and Kipling from 10, 20 or 25 years earlier that Woolf could not help but be aware of and to an extent emulate. Now, Woolf stands in an interesting relation to those European predecessors who wrote about South and Southeast Asia. That would include writers in India like Kipling and Flora Annie Steel, as well as administrator turned authors like his own patron in Ceylon, Sir Hugh Clifford, who fast-tracked Woolf's civil service career, but who also produced some remarkable fiction of his own from Malaya. Firstly, Woolf could not share with any of those people a sense of progress. Disinterested rule by an elite cadre of European officers could have its benefits, he is tempted to think, I infer. But he clearly knew too much about economics not to perceive that colonial rule had led to monopoly and stagnation. Secondly, he was not willing to idealize the purity of the village and of the rural interior of the island, in contrast to the debased cosmopolitan modernity of the coastal ports through which the country was plugged into the global economy. And this is a strategy rehearsed in not only in colonial Ceylon, but in India and other countries. It's a strategy rehearsed both by imperial apologists and by early nationalists. But Woolf, I think, perceives that it is fallacious and disingenuous. And thirdly, there is that matter of voice, and who shall assume the right to speak. In the Kipling stories, to which Woolf several times alludes in his autobiography, Kipling will either ventriloquize his Indian subjects, allowing the English reader to eavesdrop on Indian conversations, or he will stage a dialogue between an Indian speaker and a British auditor, dramatizing the latter's attempt and ultimate failure to comprehend the foreign culture with which he has to deal. But in his most sophisticated work of fiction, The Village in the Jungle, that is Woolf's novel, Woolf does neither of those things. There is, from the start, a narratorial voice that speaks of itself as I, and which describes jungle life from the position of a detached and urbane observer. Yet this voice is never explicitly connected with the European government agent, and when the latter eventually shows up in the trial scene, we do not see things through his eyes, and rather he is glimpsed from the perspective of the baffled and frightened Silindu. And I can't help but think of this as the imperfect outcome of a struggle for Woolf. He begins by assuming his own European subjectivity, and yet he finds a way of continually deferring it until it steadily diminishes through the course of the narrative. It shows us the Woolf of Pearls and Swine trying to articulate a rather different and more original way of writing about suffering and exploitation in the colony. And it also, I think, shows us a wide-awake author of the 1910s who could observe the nationalist movements growing around him and who also saw emerging indigenous writers like Rabindranath Tagore and Ananda Coomaraswamy, and who finally understood, therefore, that Asian voices could no longer be fitly housed within a European narrative frame. And I'll hand over now to Peter.
I'm just going to quickly introduce Peter as well, because we've had some people come in later. But I hope you'd finish saying what you were saying, Alex. Or did you hurry up because?
No, I'll yes, I've done.
Well, you'll have another. You'll have several other chances to speak. It's my very pleasant duty to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Peter Wilson, who's Associate Professor of International Relations at LSE and is the author of The International Theory of Leonard Woolf, a study in 20th century idealism, which was published in 2003. Could I also just announce that those of you who would like to ask questions, either to a particular panelist or to the complete panel, please do type in your questions in the chat function on YouTube, and we'll pose them after Peter has finished speaking. And once the discussion gets underway, please do type them in there, and we will ask the questions for you. But Peter, please speak now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilanjan. In my 7 or 8 minutes, I'm not going to talk much about Leonard Woolf's thought on imperialism or his experiences in Ceylon. I've written about this in a couple of chapters in the book that you mentioned earlier. And in an article that was published in the Commonwealth Journal of International Affairs, the round table. But in brief response to Minoli and Alexander's points, it seems to me that Woolf was, or at least became, an anti-imperialist of a kind. I think that was born of his political consciousness that developed when he arrived in London, not so much born of his experiences in Ceylon, which were very much reconstructed when he came to reflect on them many years later. But he was an anti-imperialist who possessed throughout the whole of his life an imperialist mindset. And this paradox is not as unusual as people might think. It's very curious and psychologically interesting, and I think it partly explains the deep paternalism that Minoli referred to. Now, what I want to talk about is Woolf's international outlook and his Fabian background and the influence of Fabianism. Now, Woolf was a rationalist, a progressive, and an internationalist. He operated intellectually in that broad space between Fabian socialism and new liberalism. International affairs, he maintained, needed to become more organized, and they needed to be democratized. He was a big supporter of the League of Nations, and I'll say something about this a little bit later, but not in any idealistic or utopian way. He recognized the League's many flaws as it was constituted by practical statesmen and negotiation in 1919, 1920. But he felt it was a pretty decent starting point for building a more rational world order. Emphasis on the rational, more on that in a second. Now, this more rational world order resided in more international organization. I think one of Woolf's contributions as a thinker was in his book, International Government, published in 2016, based on 2 supplements published in the New Statesman for the Fabian Society in 1915, was to demonstrate that a good deal more international organization existed in the world than was commonly assumed. But it had to be the right kind of international organization, not any kind of international organization. It had to be organization based on functional and, to an extent, collectivist principles. And it was international organization driven, or at least guided, by experts, not politicians, a position that doesn't sit easily with his commitment to democratization. And importantly, it had to be accompanied by the right psychology. And this I couldn't stress enough. What he termed international communal psychology, an element in his thinking that is often overlooked. What about the influence of Fabianism? As I said at the outset, this was a big part of his political education, but Woolf's induction in the world of political activity and thought came through the Women's Cooperative Guild and Margaret Llewellyn Davis, not initially the Fabian Society. And it was through Davis that Leonard and Virginia met the Webbs around 1911, and Woolf became involved in Fabian Party thinking, Fabian Society thinking and politics, and later the Labour Party. He wrote a number of reports, pamphlets and books in association with the Fabian Society, and he became its chief expert on international and later imperial questions. And the legacy of the ideas of Shaw, Graham Wallas, the Webbs and so on is strong in Woolf's writings. And I want to point to a number of things he was influenced by. Firstly, the Webbs' worship of the facts and the commitment to scientific social investigation, very important, what we might call Fabian positivism. Secondly, distrust of ideology may come across as puzzling for some listeners, but what I have in mind here was expressed by George Bernard Shaw when he said, what the British Empire wants in its government, quote, is not conservatism, not liberalism, not imperialism, but brains and political science. Thirdly, the belief that individualism and nationalism are obsolete, or at least they're obsolescent. These were 19th century ideologies, in a sense, unfit for the 20th century. Fourthly, very importantly, and something I think we've lost sight of in current debates about social reform, concern with social efficiency as much as social injustice, a very important Fabian principle. And concomitant with that, huge faith in scientific administration. One of the reasons the LSE doesn't to this day have a politics department, but instead has a government department, is that the Webbs felt that politics was the old order. The new order was scientific administration. Hence, we have a government department and a social administration department. Fifthly, a commitment to gradualism and permeation, two key Fabian principles, as a far more rational and sensible and certainly moderate method of social change than revolution or militancy, which were dangerous. And sixthly, there are other points that I could mention, but I'll just mention this one because I think it's very important when thinking about Woolf's ideas for international reform. Fear of having any idea or proposal condemned as utopian. Fabians had a morbid fear about this. Now, one respect that I should briefly mention in which Woolf, when he was writing International Government, Empire and Commerce in Africa, and other influential texts, one respect in which he departed from these Fabian staples concerns nationalism. Now, I said that Fabians had this belief at this time that nationalism was dead, or at least dying. And the line pursued by George Bernard Shaw in his quite notorious, certainly famous book, Fabianism in the Empire, was essentially that the world was becoming inevitably more rational. Nationalism was fading away, and that the logic of the inevitability of gradualness, a key Fabian axiom, was Fabian world government. Fabian world government. Now, Leonard Woolf was not so sure. Nationalism may be materially obsolete, he felt, but it was psychologically very much alive. What did he mean by this? He meant that people, for good, and in this case for ill, still thought around the world in nationalist terms, in terms of a superior us and an inferior them. And this nationalist communal psychology was just as much a fact that the world and social investigators like himself had to reckon with, as the fact of economic, financial, and political interdependence, those more material facts. That's the fact that so much of our everyday life and what we expected from it materially depended on deep international connections. And this was why education about the underlying material realities of the modern world was so important. Education about those realities was just as important as the realities themselves. And this, I think, was one of the ways in which Leonard Woolf advanced thinking within the Fabian context about the world beyond London, which the Fabian Society had been primarily concerned with up until Woolf came along. Now, in conclusion, a few brief points really about the League, because I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about this that I briefly like to clarify. And I'll also say something about this interesting question of voice. Now, as I said, Leonard Woolf was a big supporter of the League in all sorts of ways. And the League is associated with failure, with the failure to present the collapse into war in 1939, and collective security, which is also regarded as a failure. Now, for Leonard Woolf, I think it's important to note that the League of Nations was much more than a collective security organization, which did indeed fail. It was more than a new diplomatic tool. It was more than a kind of international first responder in times of emergencies. He wanted to get away with this conception, rather conservative conception that still holds sway today about the League of Nations, and indeed the body that replaced it, the United Nations. Rather, Woolf wanted to say in a number of writings, it was a focal point for a wide network of international cooperation, which had deep roots in modernity. It wasn't merely an ideal, but a working system of practical internationalism in a whole range of fields, not just security, but in medicine, science, technology, engineering, culture, academia, and so on. It wasn't to be seen as a proto-world government, and this point I think is central, but a vital source of international communal psychology. And the chief job of the League was to break down what he saw as this negative, hidebound nationalist psychology, which was doing so much damage to the world. With regard, in conclusion, to this question of voice, who was Leonard Woolf speaking for in his thinking about international organization and international affairs? Well, I think the answer to that can be found in his commitment to reason and rationalism. He was speaking for everyone. I think he would have been, rightly or wrongly, appalled by identity politics. I think he would have intensely disliked identity politics because he felt, for good or for ill, that he was speaking to rational human beings and trying to elevate through education and through detached social analysis our capability to think rationally and not emotionally about world affairs. Thank you.
Peter, thanks so much. And one of the downsides of online is, of course, the slight clunky handovers at the sort of the chair failing to come in on time. That was absolutely fascinating, and fascinating for me as the General Secretary of the Fabians today to hear you draw out some of that Fabian history, and a lot of the values you talked about, still permeate, for a want of a word, the approach that the modern Fabian Society takes to public policy and politics today. There's loads to unpack, and I think what's been so interesting about the three presentations we've heard is that we've had sort of three different slices, and particularly interesting to hear sort of political science and IR approach just now, and then the literature approach from Minoli and Alexander. And I just want to sort of begin the conversation by inviting all three of you to sort of, if you like, reflect back on what the other contributors have heard, and particularly to unpack a little bit more. Peter, you started to talk about these questions of voices that Minoli had raised, but invite Peter to sort of reflect on what, if anything, the sort of assessment of Woolf as an author, and the dialogue we've had about his engagement with the voice of Sri Lankan people as an author. What, if anything, that has to say about your interest in him in terms of his political thought? And I want to then reverse that question back to Minoli and Alexander to ask both of you what his subsequent, but sequentially subsequent sort of engagement with really being a very important thinker about international institutions coming out of the First World War, what the linkages are to that as a product of empire himself, and his engagement with Sri Lanka and with literature that you've discussed. Peter, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I found. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, you're fine.
I found Minoli and Alexander's contributions really interesting. There was quite a bit of terminology in there that I think I have a superficial understanding of, and I'd like to read some of their writings before commenting. I think with more confidence about the perspective they've taken. One question I would have is that when approaching from literary studies and cognate disciplines and fields, are you approaching Woolf as a type that throws light on something more general, or are you more interested in him as an individual with his individual experiences? One thought that when both Alex and Minoli were speaking that ran through my head was, yes, that may be true, but wasn't that fairly conventional for men of his class, his nation, and his generation, and his Oxford education, and indeed public school education at the time? I didn't think there was perhaps anything extraordinary about that, except, of course, that unlike Conrad and George Orwell and their fictional writings on empire, Woolf did attempt, very interestingly, and I made quite a lot of this in my book and the few articles that I published. He tried to write from the perspective of the inside out rather than the outside in. And I found that the critical tools that you were using to dissect that really interesting. And I think it will change my outlook on Leonard's thinking about empire and about his Ceylonese experiences.
That's great. Thank you, Peter. Can I turn to you, Minoli?
Hi, thank you. I mean, I was really fascinated by both those papers, Alexander's and Peter's. And I mean, in relation to Peter's, which is kind of really coming from a completely different disciplinary perspective than my own, was really, I mean, in response to that question about whether he's a type or an individual, which I think is a really good one. I mean, to be frank, I go straight to the text. I don't assume continuity with any author, because authors change their minds, as we all know. So I was looking really closely at Village in the Jungle as a text about how it articulates the not just the other, but the outsider. And I think it's really important that distinction is made. That we're dealing with someone who's a scapegoat. And if you relate that to Woolf's own outsidership, and sense of, and that history of Jewishness and all of that, there's a really interesting political ideology, I think, underpinning that, as to how we treat the scapegoat, because Ceylon is much more than just the outsider. So I was looking at it really as a text-based framing, and I could see distinctions between the short stories and the novel, for example, and the three short stories are quite different as well, although they're grouped together. So I'm very much a text-based kind of person in the way I address stuff. And then I look for a broader connection through authorship and through context. And in relation to Alexander's points that he raised, what I found interesting was the connections you were making with other writers of the time. And that kept coming up, as I said, when I talked about the polyphonic text, which simply means texts drawing and speaking about multiple voices, containing those voices. And novels do that in a way short stories don't, as we know, was the relationship. I could see circuits of understanding and communication. What fascinates me with a lot of literature is how writers are speaking to one another through texts. And in Village in the Jungle, I could sense there was Conrad, obviously Forster. I sensed, there was Kipling was there with the jungle. It made me think of the Jungle Book and the lore of the jungle, connecting up with that. And also D.H. Lawrence, the very deep stuff about man's inhumanity and rage and those very powerful feelings that are connected up with. So I could see, and to me, it did feel he's been spoken about, as a writer who deals very sensitively with gender, but to me, it was a very gendered text as well. I sense that. So I don't know if that's a proper answer to you, Peter, but I wasn't really thinking of type or author. I was thinking of text and connecting back through that.
Great. And Alexander, a chance for you to respond to both Peter and Minoli.
Yes, I think of Woolf as a quite idiosyncratic, really, a talented writer, his own outsider position as a Jew in the civil service, with a sophisticated economic understanding as well. I think that's something quite special that he brings to his fictional writing, which, say, other people of the author-administrator type, like Clifford or Alfred Lal in India, didn't have. But type is definitely important when you read his own fiction, because a taxonomic sensibility is crucial, isn't it, to the mindset of the imperial administrator. The imperial administrator is trained to be always putting people and things in categories within his domain, and Woolf certainly does that, particularly in the memoirs. He often uses social shorthand for certain British types that he encounters, like the sort of brutal planter or loafer type, or he'll obviously speak very snobbily as well in a patrician tone of the kind of the board school type of non-gentlemanly competition waller who's got into the imperial service or into the police through dint of passing exams and getting scholarships. He's very scathing about that sort of person. And yeah, likewise, that will also extend to his analysis of the Tamil and Sinhala people that he encounters. I think Minoli might be better able to judge than me as to what extent he does fall into that trap of categorizing people and making them representative. I think the part for me of The Village in the Jungle, a novel which is I suppose the biggest failure, is that dialogue between the European assistant government agent and the Roehampton, the authority figure, the sort of the feudal lord that he has to deal with in the administration of the district. They have briefly this English conversation which Celindu can't understand, in which effectively the AGA is engaging in a sort of raillery late at night with the Roehampton, saying, don't you, in which effectively the Sinhala gentleman comes out the worst. He's exposed as being rather insensitive to the people below him in the social hierarchy, and of a sort of complacent time server and comprador, effectively, of the system. To think back to Peter as well, actually, something that your address, Peter, really got me thinking about was where Woolf stands in respect to cosmopolitanism, because I think certainly for today, I think cosmopolitanism has become an important ethical position. It's an ethical position by which you accommodate the cultural point of view of another person, and that is a sort of necessary exercise for living with difference within a multicultural social community. And yet, Woolf, although he articulates in international politics, has, I think, a problem with cosmopolitan people and people of mixed identity. He writes in a very remarkable way about the nature of the displaced person in his autobiography, and yet he quite often falls into this old habit in the fictional writings of using, again, a cosmopolitan type as a shorthand for villainy. It's such a cliche in a way that the debt merchant who becomes one of the villainous figures in The Village in the Jungle, Fernando, is of a mixed sort of Caribbean, South Asian heritage, and has been brought up in these sort of corrupt port environments. So that sort of person, you can feel the sort of dislike within Woolf's character for that sort of person in the fictional depiction.
Thank you. Can I just apologize for having gotten up from my chair, but I don't know if Peter is at LSE or not, but we have building works going on and there's an insane amount of drilling sound outside my window. So I just wanted to shut it so I didn't disturb others when I was going to speak. But could I just pop in and go back to the brief conversation that I had with Minoli about the kind of thinking that went into it, but I'm very into sort of deciding on the title for this event. But I'm very struck by the fact that both Minoli and Alexander refer to pearls and swine, because I had read all these long ago in my life, and I know Minoli has written to me, and Alexander also wrote to me to say how it was wonderful to go back to these novels and reread them for this event. But I actually read in the last couple of weeks, along with Village in the Jungle, I actually read Growing, which is actually his narrative of his time as a civil servant in those very areas, in that locality, in that country. And I was constantly trying to think if Growing, which is a more diarized, it's a more realistic grassroots level sort of narrative of what his impressions were, whether they resonate in a work of fiction, those experiences or not. That was one thing. The other thing is I also reread, and Peter knows this, over the last 2-3 weeks, Peter's book, which I had also read a long time ago. And when Peter was speaking just now, I was thinking, and this question is actually to all three of you, I was thinking, this is an issue that we are dealing with on multiple fronts when we organize events and we discuss extremely interesting and entangled characters like Leonard Woolf. Is one, there's a question of there is the fact of what Minoli said, which is we go to texts as texts, and we read them as texts, and the texts speak to us, and we analyze the texts accordingly. I do that in history, in 14th century texts. That is my discipline. I'm a textual historian. But there's one question is, people move, people grow, people take actions, left the civil service, came here, got introduced to the webs, joined the Fabians, did a variety of things. His later writings and the influence of the Fabians is, again, something that is debatable. How much of it was how much of the Fabian set of ideas was something that influences what he does later, etc. So there's one is the progression of an individual. The other is, are we looking at different kinds of texts that perform different functions because of the nature of the text? So one is fiction, one is about internationalism, and in a sense, to be fair to Mr. Woolf, they really can't be compared even in terms of authorial perspective or intention. So, are we able to come to multiple views and versions of what the writer of those texts was attempting to say through the manner in which he was animating the text and the arguments in the text? In the work of fiction, it is one of imagery, whereas in the internationalism work, which I have not read, I've only read Peter's book, it's the purpose, the intention, the audience, everything is completely different. I say this because questions like voice, appropriation of voice, who speaks for whom, and so on and so forth, are very important questions, need to be discussed. But I keep coming back to this feeling that while it is absolutely right to pose our questions to what we are treating as sources and reading, there is also, these questions become very, very interesting when you have multiple genres of texts written by the same person. Right? So he's not a fiction writer that we can simply analyze everything. Yeah. And actually, I mean, for Minoli and for Alexander, because I'm not a person of literature, I read a lot of literature, but I'm not disciplinarily trained in literature. We confront this question. My language of study is Persian, and we confront this question in whether we are reading prose or poetry, even if it is by the same person, even if it is Amir Khusro. Because the genres can be made to function in different ways, depending on how you animate it. So I was just wondering, so I have two sets of things. One is the development, the progression of the individual. And, people do things at a certain point in a certain context, also because it was his job. And that's why I mentioned that I read it in tandem with growing, which is his narrative of, being the civil servant. So there's that. The other is, are we, can we come to multiple points of view and conclusions about the same person, depending on what we are reading? Because to me, at the moment, listening to you as an audience and as a non-specialist, Peter and Minoli and Alexander, all three of you sound equally convincing to me, but you're all talking about the same person, right? Minoli, do you want to go first?
Hi. Thank you. That's a lot of questions there, actually, but I'll try and deal with them. I think one of the key things you came up with, which I really find interesting, is the many, many genres that we're speaking about here in relation to one man. You could argue that these are many different voices, different ways of speaking. And if we take on board the fact that every genre is a contract between the writer and a reader, that there are a certain set of expectations built into a genre. So with a novel, and maybe I didn't put it very well, with a novel, you are going to get a many-voiced text. With a short story, which is often follows a different set of conventions, often has a single narrator, a single event, and an epiphany at the end. I'm talking about the really traditional short story, that follows a different model. So writers, when they write to a certain genre, are not entirely in control of the material. they're reshaping the facts to suit the genre. Inevitably, so that's why many writers will tell you, you know, I wasn't aware I was doing that, or I didn't expect that to happen in a text, or, you know, because and also novels follow certain plots. Now, what you've got in Village in the Jungle is a tragic plot. Okay, so it's plotted differently. So if you take on Hayden White's point, you know, there are certain ways of writing a tragedy or a tragic novel, and he would be following certain conventions. The unruliness of the text, I think, is partly a result of the fact that we're dealing with a writer who is interested in these many different forms and was writing a diary. And I was reading, you read Growing, I was reading his diaries alongside this. And what struck me was he was writing something that he was being asked to write. Again, there was a set audience. He was writing with a certain horizon of expectations, sort of, and to a certain model. So the many-voicedness and the messiness, I think, and it is a messy text, Village in the Jungle, and that's one of the pleasures of reading it, is because you're dealing with a writer who's interested in testing out different genres, testing out voices. Quite a bit. And if I can relate back, but before I forget it, I'm at the stage in my life where I forget things if I don't deal with them straight away. Alexander, just to raise, return to the point you raised about that very key court scene. I've just got the quote for you up here. I happen to have it in front of me because I thought it was such an interesting one that deals with what is missing when we talk about speaking to others in certain colonial framings. And I'll just read it. It's 4 lines here. From time to time, the judge said a few sharp words in English to the interpreter. Silindu and Babun were never quite certain whether he was or was not speaking to them, or whether, when the interpreter spoke to them in Sinhalese, the words were really his own, or whether he was interpreting what the judge had said. Now, for me, that's fascinating. Just in 4 short lines, he's communicated the inability to translate across, the fact that language was breaking down at that moment. And what interested me about this particular novel, Village in the Jungle, was that he was counterpointing that, I felt, with that moment of travel, on a pilgrimage when people were speaking across to each other. And you had the Hindus and the Buddhists, you had I think there was cross-class connections, but the multi-voicedness and the way they were brought together through traditions of storytelling. I mentioned the Jataka tale. So I think those two scenes, I think, can contrast really well. The court scene with its breakdown of voice and breakdown of communication and connection. And as I say, the free-flowing discourse on the other hand. So I'm sorry to return to that, but I think it does play into this notion of genre and speaking across different genres that we're talking about in relation to Woolf.
Alex, do you want to go next?
Yes, I agree with Minoli. That's the most striking thing about that scene, and what really sets it apart from, say, similar courtroom trial scenes in other colonial novels by English people in South Asia, like the rape trial scene in A Passage to India, or the dialogue with the magistrate in Kipling's story Gemini. It's that breakdown of communication. Of course, in Growing, Woolf does actually relate some of his own experiences of acting as a police magistrate. And I'm really intrigued by those because, along with the different genre difference, there's also, of course, the huge difference of time frame. Growing being published, I think, in about 1960, and consequently also the difference in audience. It's quite clear when you look at Growing that Woolf is conscious that people in Sri Lanka might read this, probably will read this, something that he was not evidently considering, I think, when writing The Village in the Jungle. So there is perhaps an aspect of it trying to present himself as being more omniscient or more skillful in interpreting people. At the same time, he does reflect on his own failings. There's that intriguing bit where a few points in the narrative of Growing, he sort of breaks into the modern day present temporal frame and talks about his his revisiting the island many years later and going to the places where he used to work and meeting some of the people. And I think there's an episode where he's actually upbraided by someone who was one of his underlings a long time ago, who suddenly sort of interrupts a long conversation of sort of platitudinous reminiscences to suddenly say, "Do you remember that case where you fined that man 50 rupees or something?" And says, "Was that fair, sir?" And then that leads him, of course, to doubt whether he really did the right thing. And of course, that's what does actually happen in The Village in the Jungle. The judge tries to do the right thing, but in fact, precipitates the whole catastrophe that closes the end of the story.
Peter, did you want to say anything?
A couple of things, really. I think they're related. Your question, Nilanjan, prompts us to ask what kind of writer was Woolf. Even though we've talked primarily about his fictional works today, he was predominantly a political writer. What kind of political writer? I mentioned the Fabian background, the Webb's worship of the facts, the commitment to scientific social investigation. Woolf talks a lot about the facts, plain and simple, in quite a number of his political writings. And on the surface, he's committed to a kind of scientific positivism. But I think he was wholly temperamentally unsuited to that. There are a lot of facts in Empire and Commerce in Africa, but one of the most striking things about that long, detailed book is the Swiftian satirical quality of so much that he has to say about the empire or empires, because he not only talks about the British Empire and imperialists and capitalists and all sorts of other nasty people. There's a very large polemical element. And one of the things I wrestled with in my PhD on Leonard Woolf's political and international thought, and later the book, is how really to understand the polemical element. I had a tendency to want to push it to one side. I don't think you do this today, but 30 odd years ago, I wanted to push it aside because it was rubbish, really. He was clearly trying to wind people up and score political points. And I didn't find that intellectually at all interesting. Now, I think there are more tools available to social scientific and researchers and literary critics and so on to make more of that and to get more understanding out of the various texts than I was able to do. So that's a big plus. I just wanted to comment very briefly on the point Alex made about cosmopolitanism, which I think is a really good one. Leonard wrote this book called After the Deluge. When was it published? 31, I think. And then there was another volume in 39, and then a later volume called Principia Politica, rather grandly, in 53. And you'd think, Alex, that would actually contain quite a bit about ethical cosmopolitanism and living with other people of different outlooks and culture as yourself, but not a bit of it, because he wasn't an ethical cosmopolitan. He was committed to cosmopolitan as a sociological stroke historical development. But I'm not sure he had the slightest interest in ethical cosmopolitanism.
Alex, that is an opportunity for you to speak up again on cosmopolitanism. Do you want to say something?
Yes, well, the positions he sometimes takes seem to articulate a kind of ethical cosmopolitanism, or that they gesture towards it. He's obviously strongly invested in his paternalist mission he takes upon himself to really try and understand people, to eliminate the level of sort of peon bureaucracy in his offices, which is separating the petitioners who want to come to him from him, the arbiter who has the power to give them justice. It feeds his own vanity, but he's very much committed to trying to understand that world. But yes, I think he doesn't see that as a force that could potentially regulate society or something that represents a sort of holistic virtue that we might aspire to and that might make us live better as a community. He does seem to have this suspicion of people who are, in spite of his own background, he has this suspicion of people who come from a mixed and sort of rootless origin, and who are not effectively committed to any particular polity, but instead are only self-interested. I think that's one of the more recherché tropes that keeps on cropping up in his writing about the colony, which he gets from his predecessor writers.
Well, I'm going to read your and Minoli's writings because I think it's most interesting, and it's a dimension of my own work that is sadly lacking. A very brief response. I think if you are an ethical cosmopolitanist, and certainly if you're a scientific investigator, one of the qualities you must have is the ability and willingness to change your mind and your outlook. I don't think Leonard Woolf changed his mind on anything.
Great. Let me come in for a moment. One reflection, as we've been talking about different types of writing, is, as I said right at the start, he was also a jobbing journalist, and that makes me reflect on length of writing being very important as well. That he might be writing something for a short deadline to go in a paper the next week, but on a similar topic also be working at great length with great detail, as Peter, you talked about, long works. And I'm sure that sort of the iterative nature of writing on similar topics in different formats is very important. I just wanted to address a question to Peter particularly. You sort of said at the start of your talk that you weren't going to engage in detail on his anti-imperialism when you sort of mainly focus on the sort of international government themes. But I would like to invite you just to sort of comment on the connections or lack of between those two, sort of dimensions of his thinking, and the fact that he was someone who was bred out of the inequalities of empire, even if he was also nuanced about it, and how that interaction worked between his vision of something that was quite I guess ahead of its time when compared to other thinkers in the 1910s on international cooperation and partnership, but at the same time sort of how did that interact with his views on empire?
Yeah, this is a huge question, Andrew, and I devoted a number of chapters to it in the book, and I've written other chapters elsewhere on this. How can I respond? Well, in 1926, Beatrice Webb described Leonard Woolf as an anti-imperial fanatic, and I think she used that rather strong term because Woolf had started to go down the road, which was quite a radical one, even in left progressive circles at the time, of thinking that self-government is better than good government. This was something that I don't think the Webbs, and for many people in this on the centre, on the left, and certainly the right of British politics, could not accept for a number of generations. I don't think there was much understanding that in the 1910s and 20s that the days of empire were numbered. In the center and on the left, I think there was a growing sense that it wouldn't go on forever, but it would be several generations before peoples in the various empires would be ready for self-government. And the Webb's position was very strongly that the current colonial governing class was an absolute disgrace and a disaster, corrupt, irresponsible, ignorant, stupid, and the empire was on a very bad path. But if we had a change of government and a change of colonial administration and more Fabians took up these roles, things would be a whole lot better. Things would still be very paternalistic and imperialistic, but it would be positive paternalism and positive imperialism rather than the negative, exploitative imperialism of the past. I think Leonard Woolf was one of the first people to start to think, well, hang on a second, that day may never come. And in the meantime, we're sitting on a very large empire consisting of diverse peoples, many of whom we're largely ignorant of, as my experiences in Ceylon suggested, with the various white sections of colonial society, the white colonists, and we're making a complete hash of it. So why not start to think about handing over responsibility to quote unquote native politicians? Because when they make a hash of it, at least it's their own hash and it's not our hash. I think that was the kind of thinking he was starting to entertain. On the, oh gosh, it's such a huge question, but on the connection with that on international government, yes, he called for more international government of empire. He was a big supporter of the mandates system, and he wrote extensively on this. And the Mandates Commission of the League of Nations, relatively understudied, but very successful in all sorts of ways in improving living standards and trying to get colonial governments to honor their commitments to spend more on colonial education, for example, rather than the pittance that they'd spent up to that point. Things like that in fields of health, education, and so on. And what he wanted to do was extend the mandate system to all colonies, not just the conquered territories of the Ottoman and German empires, but to all colonies. And obviously that meant with very stiff resistance from many quarters, including from his own party.
And fascinatingly, I think that interface, carried on for decades. Within the Fabian Society, Leonard Woolf was, cheek by jowl with people who were very much of that, enlightened colonial administration, gradual shift to self-rule over decades perspective, right up till the 1940s and early 50s. The Fabian projects, research, writing in that vein, often with Leonard Woolf sitting on the committees that were publishing them. So there's sort of the ambiguity of the British left really is just, sort of made very personal in that sort of interaction that he would have had. Angela.
Yeah, I was just going to briefly say something, and I wanted to bring Minoli and Alexander into the conversation, the context of what Peter has said. But before that, I just want to say a couple of things in passing. One is Peter has been very generous more than once to say that he would read Minoli's and Alexander's writings. Could I urge Minoli and Alexander to read Peter's book as well? Because I think you will find it very, very fascinating. His book, I can tell you, is more brutal than he sounds when he speaks now. It's extremely readable, and the weather has been lovely, so I spent a lot of time sitting outside reading it. You really must read it, I think, because of the context of it, and in light of what Peter has said just now. Peter, to you, what I was going to say before I pose my question to Minoli is, this is just a comment, it's not a question, is that yes, you're absolutely right. In the last 30 years that so many of us have been doing research, the tools for doing research tools have changed, evolved. In certain instances, new ones have come up. But the other thing, and this is especially true for when we are reading texts, including political texts, is it's not just the tools, and I hope Minoli and Alexander will also agree with me, but the categories of analysis have also changed. We now have newer categories to analyze and of analysis, and we, we sort of harness our intellectual energies towards deciphering traces. And all these words I'm using are all taken from this discursive practice of how we read texts. But to what I wanted to ask Minoli, because this is in the context, and this is something all of us who read texts know, is the whole question of polyphony that you mentioned. And you mentioned it, you were very clear in a particular context, and in the context of today's discussion, but also in the context of a particular text that you're talking about. But things like polyphony, things like the use of words from a certain language, okay, which not only seek to, and this is a terribly colonial word to use in front of any person who studies post-colonial literature, but to indigenize the reading by using words from the language, but also, as I'm sure anyone who knows Sinhala will agree, that the use of words from Sinhala also convey to the modern reader the untranslatability of certain imageries, just what they signify, those words. So, but my question to you was, and I'm very, very interested to hear both yours and Alex's view as well, because I know Alex's actual research interests are in other parts of South Asia, is one of the ways in which all of us definitely look at texts and the connection with the author is in the way that you have elaborated. But we all also know that the flip side of it is to also try and work out the sympathetic links that tie the author to the novel or to the subject. And I read Village in the Jungle very carefully over the last week. And there were many occasions and instances where I was struck, I wouldn't say by the sympathetic tone, but the effort that the author had made to convey detail, to be able to conjure images that were as close to the reality that he wanted to conjure. And I was wondering whether you wanted to say something about this side of the critical engagement in post-colonial studies of, the multiple ways in which, we are blessed with multiple tools of analysis now, and the multiple ways in which authors speak to us through whichever text of theirs we choose to study. Because, and this is something I didn't mention earlier, is that when we were working on the title for this event, the whole question of using the word voice and to use it as a gerund, to call it voicing, is, I'm very happy to say that I'm completely guilty of this trick. Because what I was actually trying to do, and what has come out so eloquently and interestingly in this discussion, is what are the imperatives as well as what are the sympathies, even if they are not sympathetic, that go into voicing. Given that we know all the other details about the author, that he was a civil servant, he was a colonial civil servant, he came back to Britain because he wanted a break, and then he just decided he doesn't want to go back, and it sort of suddenly ended, and then he meets the Webbs, etc. I was wondering if you wanted to say something about that, Minoli, and then Alex.
So many things packed once again in there.
That's the second time you've said this to me.
It's true. You ended up with voice, but you began with something completely different, I think. In relation to, I mean, so lots and lots of things are coming into my head as you were talking there. And you're absolutely right. There are many, many different tools now for analysis that have come in, which are actually anachronistic, because you could argue that the critical theories we're using, which have evolved, are coming, so much later. And evolved in a different context from obviously the time Woolf was writing in. I think it's important to note that he's a realist writer broadly. So as a result, you will get typologies coming into place. So he's writing within a certain frame, but you can see the beginnings of modernism, the investment in sort of breaking out into digressions into people's thoughts, and also the engagement with feelings. You talked a little bit about reflecting on the country, and that, I must say, was one of the things that really struck me on reading the text, was how he took such care to engage with the feel of the place, the feel of being in Sri Lanka. You can read that, and it's very sensory. And there's a deep love of place and engagement with place that comes through. The novel begins with the jungle, but then you've got other moments in relation to village life when you talk, and also the view when the judge is looking on at the landscape. It's more than just a landscape, it's really felt. So that's why I engage with that point about the feeling of facts. And I was really interested in what Peter had to say about rationality and reason being so important, because I think for me, that's a real tussle in Woolf's texts with the desire to engage with facts, evidence, and those things, but then the actual reality on the ground of things that he cannot encapsulate in words, and that facts alone will not sort of accommodate. So when we're talking about voice, and I think the voicing is important, because what it takes us into is that this is a process. It unsettles things. There's nothing fixed about this. And when we're reading Woolf, 100 odd years later, we are actually relating back to a different time as well. So our reading process has to engage with where we're at now. And Peter drew on sort of this notion of identity politics, which is so current. And, one of the things that occurred to me when reading it also was, this term that's been bandied about so much, cultural appropriation. No one's raised it, but it's a very thorny, difficult issue. But, where does our own engagement sit with the discourses that are happening today as well? The other thing, I'm not really, I know I'm not directly answering your question, because there were so many there, but I think I'm sort of working my way around different issues that I think are important, that relate to what you said. One of the things I would like to talk a little bit about is the fine grain with which he's trying to read the country. Peter took us very usefully into the macro element, but what Woolf's text takes us into is the micro side of the nation. And another thing that occurred to me was his engagement with caste. He engaged with, quite early on, that he was dealing with he called them the Goya caste, they called the Goigama caste in the country, the farmers, he called them the cultivators. And some of those types that he brought about were actually from other castes. So he might well have been making a statement about that. And of course, in the story, The Two Brahmins, he deals with caste very directly and shows that how ingrained it is in people's lives and in people's engagements, that no matter what, these two outcasts, because they'd actually broken with caste, the two main characters break with caste, one a Brahmin who starts fishing and the other one who starts carrying earth on his head. Despite that, will not unite. The caste element is so ingrained. So I think what he's taking us into is that, when we talk about internationalism and we talk about common humanities, that there are certain elements in society that actually require some major shift in people, in social thinking, in customs. And he keeps using in that short story, The Two Brahmins, he keeps saying, These things have existed for hundreds of years. These things have existed for centuries. And there's definitely a sense that this will carry on existing, that nothing will break it. And these are the elements that I think make Woolf really so relevant today, because he's right about certain things. There was a real continuity, and also the lot of the farmer. That's the other thing that struck me, actually, was that today, farmers in Sri Lanka, debt is a major issue. You know, perhaps for different reasons, but it's a major, major issue. There was a real sense of contemporary relevance in reading his work, I felt. So, yeah, that doesn't answer your question, but it just takes me into such sort of issues.
No, thank you. I mean, I wasn't very, very coherent myself, but could I just quickly say a couple of things, and maybe Alex may pick up on these. One is, when you were talking about detail, the thing that I was struck by, and I'm a lover of Sri Lanka, and at one time in my life, I had the privilege, and it is nothing short of a privilege, to actually visit the country twice a year for a series of years. So you know, I mean, it's again a very different exposure, but I was not only struck by the detail, and that is what I was referring to, but I was also struck by the way in which detail was woven into the pace of the novel.
Yes, yes.
So that the detail actually creates pace, the speed in the novel. I don't use the word speed normally for text, but you know, it is the pace. And it was very, very significant. The other thing was the context in which Woolf introduces characters into context. So he begins and it's the forest. And there's just, you think, okay, I'm sort of reading about a forest, you know, and then slowly people start coming into the forest, and, you know, characters start coming up, and, you know, there's a very interesting, a trick, if one must use that word. That's one. The question about cultural appropriation, which you used and which applies to us. I spent a lot of time and decided not to use the term appropriating voice, because to me, that would have been judgmental by its very use if I were to say appropriating. The second thing is, I don't think it would have served the purpose of being able to generate a discussion like this. And I also think that there is a debate to be had, which all of us can have on another occasion, about where we are in these debates of decolonization of race and empire and appropriation and voice, and you know, what are we coming with? And that's one of the reasons why I said to Peter that in addition to tools of analysis, there are also categories of analysis we grapple with. Because you know, where are we in this? To say absolutely nothing about where are we with this because of social media, and we are not going to talk about that. Alex.
I was also thinking, Nilanjan, during the while rereading The Village in the Jungle, about the use of Sinhala words and how it might be different from the techniques used by earlier writers. I haven't quite made my mind up. I haven't quite made my mind up. Because certainly it's not a novelty in British author fiction from South Asia. Writers like Kipling or Edwin Arnold will also lard their English prose with phrases and words, idioms, sometimes translated idioms from different vernacular languages. But there is something different in the quality of the way that Woolf does it. The words have a very sort of ordinary nature to them. They're typically either quite sort of ordinary things associated with rural life and farming, or they are germane to speech. They're sort of honorifics, terms that are used to address a superior, or to address from a woman to a man, or from a daughter to a father, and they're indicative of the social relations connecting the characters. So that is distinctive, and I like the way very much that you're rewarded for paying attention to that as a reader. Early on, there is a footnote explaining to the reader that, according to the tradition, a Sinhala wife will not refer to her husband by his name. And right at the end of the novel, that becomes relevant, if you remember it, when Punchy Menaka goes to the prison to inquire after what's happened to her husband. And of course, the warder asks her, well, what is the man's name? And she's too ashamed to say the name. And then, of course, he calls her a fool, says, you know, how can I tell what's happened to your husband if I don't know his name? So you only understand that dialogue if you've picked up on what happened earlier. So I think, yeah, there's something distinctive about the way that's used, contrasted with, say, the words that Kipling puts into his stories, which have a more sort of exotic ring to them. I'm reminded of a conversation that took place in literary Bloomsbury, the world that Woolf joined between the Indian novelist Mulkraj Anand and Bloomsbury man of letters Bonamy Dobray, who had been reading some old Kipling stories and asked Anand to explain to him what the word chabara meant from Punjabi, and of Anand's annoyance at being forced to explain this rather esoteric word that would never really feature in everyday conversation. Like Minoli, I'm also very appreciative of the way the debt is treated by Woolf. Woolf really understands the way there's a whole agricultural economy of debt within the district that he knows. And it's obviously a problem for the community as a whole when effectively it is more profitable to buy debt using your capital, as Fernando does, than to use that capital to, say, start another business or to grow the economy in some way.
Okay, well, thank you. Minoli, go ahead. Sure, go ahead.
So just very quickly, just to add to Alexander's point, which I completely agree with, I just want to say that one of the things that also struck me was that he captured the way people speak. You talked about the pace of it and the pace of time, but the register in relation to speech was absolutely spot on, I felt. Yeah.
Thank you. We are getting to almost 2 hours. So I am going to try and end this. Would anyone like to say anything as closing remarks? Peter, would you like to say something?
Nilanjan, can you give me a moment? I did have something on my mind, but I've just my mind's just frozen, so it may pop back in a minute.
Okay, we'll come back to you. Alex, did you want to say anything by way of closing remarks?
My mind's gone blank. Nothing in particular, no. I already said what I wanted to say about debt and Woolf's economic understanding. Okay,
Peter, you're back.
I'm back, yes. Alex has kindly reminded me of it. Woolf's economic understanding. This is an interesting question. He even deep into the 1930s, he remained committed to cooperative ideals as a non-market approach to international and domestic economic organization. And I spent a long time reading his writings about international cooperative trade and the cooperative movement. He was rightly skeptical of a movement away from the market towards state planning. And he pinned his colors to an expansion of the cooperative movement. It may sound slightly daft now, but at the time, the cooperative movement was huge and expanding. It was a major player economically in a number of economies, including New Deal, United States, Australia, Canada, elsewhere. Now, I mention this because today this reads as utterly unconvincing. There are all sorts of problems with analysis. So I'd like to qualify your comment slightly, Alex, and say, I think he was a good microeconomist born out of experience, running Hambantota, the economic life of Hambantota, to some degree, as a manager of the Hambantotan economy. And of course, he was a successful businessman with Virginia and the Hogarth Press and his other publishing interests that Andrew mentioned. He was a successful businessman, as his chum Maynard Keynes was a successful capitalist. He played the markets very successfully. But I think Woolf's macroeconomic knowledge was slender, to say the least. And that's partly because of the schooling and the education he'd received, which contained zero economics, absolutely zero. So if they didn't learn it, from the practical involvement in business activities and administrative activities, they'd have to read it from a text. And even though Woolf reviewed during his publishing career, this is another dimension, Andrew, that we didn't mention, over 1,000 books. Amazing but true. He reviewed over 1,000 books. Very, very few of them pertain to economic affairs. Very, very few. And of course, far fewer were published in those days.
Minoli, did you want to say anything?
No, I mean, just to lower the tone, I can give you the family anecdote if you wish.
Please do, please.
To end it up. Oh no, it's just that you mentioned rightly that my grandfather worked for Leonard Woolf. It was in the Office for Births, Deaths and Marriages, and I think it was one of my granddad's first jobs. He would have been quite a young man, and there's stories of him going off with him on some of his trips, up to Kandy and stuff. So he remembers he worked in the same office, basically. That was it. But if you fast forward 50 years, my uncle, Garmini Salgado, who was teaching at the University of Sussex at the time, belonged to a literary society which was headed by Leonard Woolf in Lewes, which is not far from Rodnell, where they lived, and heard that Leonard Woolf loves Sri Lankan food. Came back home one time and said, we're having him over for dinner, and my aunt just remembers having to rustle up this Sri Lankan meal, which, as everyone would know, is a pretty complicated business. And when I asked her, what does she remember of the evening? All she was able to tell me was really the intricacies of the cooking. She didn't remember any of the conversation, and which is probably not too surprising because my aunt happens to be from Czechoslovakia. So that's a little bit of family history, which is lowering the tone probably, but
no, not at all. It's very interesting, and I mean it very seriously, because we are still, perhaps luckily, still living in times when these connections are still very real, and it gives us a perspective to discuss these topics and these themes. And I can tell you, and Andrew knows this because I have been in conversation with Andrew over the last year, just thinking this through and formalizing it and articulating it. And there's an entire web page on the South Asia Center where I've written why we are doing this series. It's not been easy. Today it's Leonard Woolf, but whether it was Lasky or whether it was the Webbs, or if it's going to be Nicholas Calder and his participation in Nehru's 5-year plans, there are conversations to be had, and they're not easy conversations, but they can be fascinating and interesting. And I think both Andrew and I believe can be very, very productive conversations. Andrew, would you like to say something, and then I will say goodbye?
Just to thank all our speakers and everyone who's been watching and listening as well. As Nilanjan said, this is an ongoing conversation, and certainly at the Fabian side, we're continuing to do a lot more work trying to dig through the nuance and subtlety of our past, and often sort of competing strains happening side by side, as I remarked a moment ago. It's so important for a sort of modern think tank that's sort of like practicing politics today. We tend to be very bad at looking over our shoulder and thinking about how our past, sort of invisibly, it sort of infuses everything that we do. So this series and today's event has been incredibly helpful.
Thank you very much. It now remains for me to first thank our very loyal audience of now 13 people, but had started with a much higher number who have been watching this. And there have been some comments which I didn't read out because they weren't questions. But thank you to the audience. Thank you to our speakers, Dr. Alexander Bubb, Professor Minoli Salgado, Dr. Peter Wilson, and thank you to you, Andrew, and for the collaboration with Fabian Society, which is very important for both the institutions. And no doubt we will return to these conversations in future in different ways. And I hope also in the context of Sri Lanka, and I hope in an interdisciplinary context like this. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.